This is Gemara Baba Basra Daf Chof Zayin, and all the learning for today has been dedicated as an incredible zchos Aliyat Neshama for Feiga Itta Bas Ali Bakhayin. B'siyata Deshmaya, the zchos HaTorah should bring Feiga Itta Bas Ali Bakhayin higher and higher in Gan Eden Shalmayla, closer to the Kisei HaKavod, B'siyata Deshmaya, the incredible zchos HaTorah, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, the zchos that knows no bounds, should be a Meilatz Yosher for her son, who Baruch Hashem, we're zeichet to learn the daf together with daily, and for the entire family, and ultimately for the entire Chabura. Of Amid Beis, we're about 12 lines from the bottom at the two dots. This is really a direct continuation of the previous mamish line of the Gemara, in which we learned that a tree requires a shish esrei amos, 16 amos, for nourishment's sakes. Amar Ula, continuing directly, teaches Ula, Ilan hasamach l'meisam zoch sheshei amma gazlanu. If someone plants a tree within 16 amos of a boundary, he's considered a gazlan. Why? Because it's within 16 amos, it's drawing the nourishment, the nutrients from not your field, from your neighbor's field. So you're stealing from that neighbor. And therefore, teaches Ula Chedish, you can't bring bikurim from those fruits because these are considered stolen. As Rashi points out, why not? Because it has to be asher tavi me'artzecha. And we cannot call this me'artzecha as the nourishment is coming from the neighbor's field. Asks the Gemara, Menalil Ulaha, where does Ula get this from? If this came from the Mishnah, we have 10 scattered small trees throughout a Beisa. One is allowed to plow the entire Beisa on their account until Rosh Hashanah of the Shemitah year. Why? Because plowing allows these small trees to develop and does not prepare the land, meaning it's only for the small trees, which is what you're allowed to do, ad Rosh Hashanah. You're allowed to keep the trees alive. You're just not allowed to prepare the land for the Shemitah year. But then what would come out if we are allowing you to plow the entire field? Seemingly very clear is an entire Beisa is giving nourishment to these 10 trees. So kama havalahu. So how big is a Beisa? Trei alfin v'chamish mea garmidi. 2,500 garmidi, 2,500 squared amos. And therefore, if you divide that by 10, how much is each tree? Masayin v'chamishin, 250 square amos. So what's the problem? This does not work. Apologies, or Gemara just shrunk. There we go. According to Ula, how much you need? 16 amos in each direction, which would be 1,024 square amos. Okay, the math here is not so simple, but the Gemara is assuming that if we put a tree in the middle, you have 16 amos on either side, and therefore that would be 32 amos by 32 amos, and therefore you need 1,000 square amos per tree. And yet, the Mishnah that we just quoted said how much you need, 250 amos per square tree, much less. So where did Ula get this number? And again, we quoted a Mishnah that said we have 10 trees scattered in the whole field. You're allowed to plow the whole field, which means this field is providing nourishment for these trees. How big is the field? 2,500 square amos. Divided by 10, 250 square amos per tree, which is, I don't know, something roughly by 12 or 11 something amos in each direction. Not 16, because 16 in each direction is 32 by 32, which is over 1,000 square amos per tree. So where did Ula get this from? So 2 lines from the bottom, Elamid Tanan, we try a different Mishnah. A Mishnah says, shal gimel b'nei adam, 3 trees of 3 people. Hare'elu mitzarfim, they combine and they have a din of a pardes, of an orchard. V'charshin, and therefore you're allowed to plow kol beisa bishvilan. You're allowed to plow the entire beisa on account of these 3 trees. Again, 3 trees in a field allows us to plow the entire field on account of these 3 trees. So says the Gemara, here we go. Let's do some math. So how big is a beisa? We just said a moment ago, 2,500 square amos. If we divide it by 3, is how much? 833 and a third. Says the Gemara, Ulas is still bigger, because as we said, Ulas is 1,024. Says the Gemara, Laidak. Ula wasn't precise, it required a little bit more. Says the Gemara, 1 second, this is backwards. Eimer Darmin and Laidak is the Chumra. Lekula Laidak. Could we actually say Lekula? When Ula says that it's potter from Bikurim based on this, that's a Kula. He's expanding the measurements. 16 Amos. It's not a Chumra. It's a Kula. Now he's saying it's not your tree. And now he's saying you want to bring Bikurim based on it. Says the Gemara, we're doing the math wrong. Mi amrina and mi savers beribua. Do you think that when Ula says 16 amos, he means in a square? Ka amrina and bi gula. What Ula meant is in a circle. And this is, of the classical Gemaras that we have in Sukkah and elsewhere. How do we figure out the circles and the squares? Ka amrina and mechti. Let's figure it out. How much bigger is a square than a circle? Ravia, a quarter. And therefore, a quarter of 1024 is 256. Pashilu zayin meya vishitin vitamni 768. We get rid of a quarter, because now instead of going 16 by 16 in a square, we're going in a circle. And therefore, says the Gemara, you got to get rid of a quarter of 1024, which it puts us down to 768. But now the problem is the other way. Akati Bashle Balgadamsa. But says the Gemara, we're still missing a half an amma, because what do we say? 833 and a third, which is 16 and a half amos. Ula was only 768, was only 16 amos. And on this, Hainu Deloidak, Ula Chumra Loidak. So now we see that Ula is being Lachumra. Instead of saying 16 and a half amos per tree in the circle, he's saying in the radius of the circle, he's saying what? He's saying 16 amos, which is getting us 833 as opposed to, he's getting us 768 squared amos as opposed to 833. And that is the chumrah of Ula with regard to Bikurim, that a tree within 16 amos of a field, you not bring Bikurim. Says the Gemara, Ta Shema. After we finally figured out the numbers of Ula, let's ask some kashas on Ula. We learn in a Brisa that if someone buy a Mishnah and Bikurim, someone buys a tree, and the land, maybe he brings Bikurim from this tree, and he has to say the parsha Bikurim. Says the Gemara, my love is not talking about Kol Shehu. This is not talking about he purchased a little bit of land around the tree. It doesn't say anywhere you have to purchase a full 16 amos around your tree. So no lie. Ula doesn't explain the Mishnah Yudvav Hama. Tashma another kasha. Kaddish Eilan is b'toch shel chavera. Maybe v'noi kairei. Hashleish. He bought 3 trees. Maybe v'kairei. My love Kol Shehu does not mean that there's a little bit of land around it. It says more lie. Hachanami Yudvav Hama. And again, Ula is continuously explaining that even though the Mishnayos are not explicit about this detail, but Ula is learning that when it says you could bring Bikurim from such a scenario, means that there are 16 amos surrounding such a tree. Rav Akiva Imer Karka Kol Shehu Chayev B'Peya. A little bit of Karka, you have to bring Peya Ubikurim. The Koisen love Prusbol. And you write a prusbul on such a little piece of land, as we turn over to Chav Zayin Amid Beis, V'niknin Imah Nechasim, And with such a little piece of land, you could acquire property. So what do we see? Says the Gemara, we see clearly a piece of land that is less than 16 amos is butter from bikurim. Is chayiv in bikurim, not like ula. Explains the Gemara, on the second line of Chavzayin Beis, Bechiti. This is talking about wheat stalks, and wheat stalks require only a little bit of land to grow on, and they don't need the full 16 amos like Ula said. They can bring you right. Diktani kol shu shma mi no. Tashema on the third line, and we continue asking on Ula. Elon makes us a baretz. O makes us a bechutz laaretz. We have a tree part in Eretz Yisrael, part in chutz laaretz. Tavel v'chulin merabim zeh b'zeh. The tree is considered a mixture of tevel and non-tevel. Divrei Rebbe. Rashba goimer hagadol b'chiyav chayav hagadol b'ptur patur. Whatever is in each part of the land has its chiyav. So says the Gemara, Ad kan loy pligi is machlokes Rebbe and Rashbag ela demar savar yesh mar savar ein breira. The shaila is it certainly was mixed. The question is, when I take off an apple, when I take off part of this item from this tree, do we say yesh breira? That retroactively we know it came from this part of the tree or that part of the tree. However, but everyone's clearly holding that if it came from the potter area, it's going to be potter, even though the tree is certainly within 16 amos of the boundary as it goes over the boundary. Explains the Gemara, no. Unique case, the mapsik sunma, that underground between the bordering area, there's a rock that separates the two areas, and therefore the roots on one side are not nourished at all from the land on the other side. Says Mar, 1 second, Yachi, my time with the Rebbe. The Hadri, my time with the Rebbe. What's the reason of Rebbe that he says they're all mixed together? They're not mixed together. It's half of this and half of that side with a rock in between. Says Gemara, the Hadri, Arvi, that in the trunk of the tree, the nourishments get mixed together. The is, does the nourishments get remixed in the air or only based on the roots below or not? So many questions on Ula, and Ula has defended all of them. Continues the Gemara, V'sheish Esrei Ama V'sulai. About 20 lines down, the first one line is Esrei, which is also about 12 lines from the Y lines. Ask the Gemara in Ula, is it only 16 amos? V'atanai we learned in the Mishnah. Marchikin es Elon min abar chofei ama. Amar Abaye explains by Mezel Tuva Vasli. Of course, the roots travel much further. The roots travel up to 25 amos. However, they only draw nourishments for 16 amos. He asked a similar shayla. Amar Lei responded just like Ula, 6 lines from the wide lines. Gazlanu. Vein vevin ven bekurim kiasarevan. Amar Rav Yechanan. Echad Ilan hasamach lamesar. Vechlan Ilan hanoite. It's planted. Mevi v'kaire. Shalmanaski and hinchel Yeshua li Yisrael as Aretz. Because on this condition, the Yeshua separated Eretz Yisrael, that you're allowed to plant it near the boundary, and it's not going to be considered that you're stealing from the neighboring field, and therefore you even be allowed to be mevi v'kaire bikurim. We continue with the Mishnah at the very end of the narrow lines on Chavzayin Mabes. Ilan shonata l'stei chaveri. If one's branches extend into your friend's field, kaitzeitz, the neighbor's allowed to cut them off. Malei hamardeya. He's allowed to cut off the mount for the full ox goad al gabe machrish on top of the plow. Ubacharov ubeshekma. If it's carob or sycamore tree, keneged hamashkalais. You're allowed to cut off all the branches that you extend over the line into your property. Beis hashlachin. If it's an irrigated field, kola ilan, then keneged hamashkalais. He can cut all the branches along the line of the boundaries. Abashal Omer, Kol Ilan Srak, Keneged HaMishkalos. Any barren tree, not fruit tree, you cut along the boundary. Now, whether Abashal is arguing the Tanakama is not clear at the moment. So says the Gemara, Abashal Arishikaya, this didn't have Abashal that he said anything over the boundary you cut down. Tashema de Tanya Beisashlachan Abashal Omer, Kol Ilan Keneged HaMishkalos. We have a brayso that the brayso teaches Beis Hashlachim. And on the case of Beis HaShlochin, that's where Abba Shaul says, Kol Ilan Keneged Amish Kolois, Keneged, the line over the boundaries, because the shade of the tree is bad for the irrigated field. Shema Mina, Reisha Shema Mina. Amar Rav Ashi, guess what? Mastisa nami take it the tani kolilan strak. So Amar Bishlamar Reisha Kai, I know tani kolilan. Ali Amar Daseva Kai, Ilan strak mi bayale. Why would he have to say Ilan strak if it's going on the Seifa? Because the Tanakh was talking about all trees, and he's only talking about less trees. So why would he write kol? Alav Shema Mina Reisha Kai. It must be clear that he's going on the Reisha. We continue one last short Mishnah to wrap up this incredible second parak. Ilan Shao Naiteler Shazarab. Now we have the other way. The previous, we've been discussing trees into neighboring fields. Now we have a tree that extends over a Shazarabim. Kite says you cut down so that a camel and its rider could clear underneath the tree. Rabbi Yehuda Imer Gamelton Pishton carrying flax, Chavile Zemurais or bundles of twigs. Rav Shimon Imer Kolilin Keneged Amishkalais, Mimnei Atoma, you can cut down the entire tree that's going into the Rishus Rabbim. Why? Mimnei Atoma. Because anything under a tree transmits Toma, and therefore you can cut down the whole thing, as the Gemara is going to explain in a moment. Says the Gemara, Man Tana, who is the Tana that holds Dibini Zakin Basra Umdana the Hashtaz Linan? We go with regard to Nizakin, we go to the situation right now, and we're not worried about the future. Because the Mishnah said the branches over Shasram, you cut those down because those are harmful. Doesn't say that we're allowed to take into consideration. As you look at Rashi on the first very wide line, what does Rashi say? Tikatani kaitzes min hanafim kidei sheigamul iver v'rachva reichayzim v'gadol nachar zman. They're going to grow back. And nowhere in the Mishnah did it say that we can take into consideration the potential future. So we see that we're gauging it based on right now. Amarei shlakish b'machlekes shnuya. This is a machlekes Rav Eliezer, and the Mishnah is Rav Eliezer. It's not. You're not allowed to make a dig. You're not allowed to dig a hole. The water cisterns and ditches, etc. Where in a Rishus Rabbim. Whereas Rav Eliezer matir as long as you cover it enough that a wagon can carry what could travel over it with stones. Rabbi Yechon Amar Afilu Tema Rabbanon. No, we can even say that it's the Rabbanon. You don't have to say the Mishnah is only Rav Eliezer. The reason is because in the case you're making a pit under the street, you could on its own be mafches. You don't realize the pit slowly deteriorates a little bit, and you're not going to realize it. And that's the reason why it will fit, even if the sheet of a chachamim, that we would, yes, have to be worried about future damages. Aval in our Mishnah, what's the problem? There's a tree over Shasharam, so you cut it down. You want to say, but wait, in 2 weeks it's going to grow more and create new damages. Okay, so you'll cut it down more then. Meaning, Rav Eliezer, it's not only Rav Eliezer in the Mishnah, it can even be the Chachamim. We continue quoting the next part of the Mishnah. Rav Yehuda Omer, Gamol Ta'an Pishtan, Chavile Zmayres, Ibayalu asks the Gemara, Shiura de Rav Yehuda Nafish, Oidam Ashura de Rabbanan Nafish. Which one is greater? Is a camel with its rider taller, or is the Rabbanan is a camel holding flax taller, or a camel with a rider taller? Says Gemara, Pshita, the Shiura de Rabbanan Nafish. That the Rabbanan is greater, which is with the rider. These are the Shiura de Rav Yehuda Nafish. Rabbanan B'Shura de Rav Yehuda Heichiyavit. So what do the Rabbanan do with the shear of Rav Yehuda? Says Gemara, Velamai Shur de Rabbanan Afish, Rav Yehuda B'Shur de Rabbanan Ma'avish. So what's the machlaikis? Says the Gemara, no, Efsha Degachan V'Chalav Tutei. That's not a kasha, because the rider, the Rabbanan say you only cut it down to the amount of a camel with the flax. What about a guy on the back of the camel? What are you going to do? So bend down. He's not concerned about that, and that's going to be the machlaikis Rabbanan and Rav Yehuda in the Mishnah. We conclude with the final part of the Mishnah. Rav Shimon Aimer teaches Rav Shimon, Kol Ilan, Keneged Ambishkalas B'nei Atoma. You cut down everything that's hanging over the boundary because of the Tama. Tana. When they Oyal Atoma. Because of oil atoma, because the tree goes over, which creates an oil, and everything underneath it becomes tummy. Says Gemara Pshita, of course, when they had toma tanan, it says because of the toma. Explains the Gemara, imas nisan av amina toma maisi oirev toma vishadi asam. Just the mish, I would have thought that we're worried about an oirev, a crow, that'll bring something toma and throw it onto the branches, and someone who comes underneath it would be tame. Visagye b'dechalchule ba'alma, and therefore it would be enough just to thin out the branches enough that it can't be holding a piece of toma on it. Kamash malan, the Gemara that what? It's oil atoma. Therefore, thinning it out won't work because then anything, it will transmit the toma, anything underneath it. So of course, time for Chazara as we move over to the famed Cheskes Abatim. Tav Chav Ches B'siyata Dishmaya.